Good afternoon, everyone. Good. And those of you in the back, quick sound check. Can you hear me okay? Would you raise your hands in the very back? Good, good. Thank you. Well, as I think most of you know, I'm John Alger, president here at James Madison University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth and final event of the Madison Vision Series for this academic year. Through the Madison Vision Fund, we're proud to sponsor the Madison Vision Series and want to thank our series co-sponsor, the Office of Madison Institutes in Outreach and Engagement, as well as all the supporters of the fund who've made this series possible. In this series, we've explored deep and enduring questions in our society, and we've pushed ourselves to reflect upon how we can each be the change and make a positive difference in the world. As an institution of higher education in which we cultivate and celebrate the marketplace of ideas and diversity of perspectives, one of our central challenges is to find ways to model and foster civil discourse. Dr. Christopher Phillips, our featured speaker today, has spent much of his life encouraging and teaching people of all backgrounds to engage in and learn from civil discourse. I first met Chris last autumn at a conference on civics education held at Montpelier, the home of James and Dolly Madison. I was impressed by his passion for inquiry and the creative ways he inspires people to engage in deep thinking and learning about democracy. Chris is a renowned expert in the Socratic method. As a recovering lawyer myself, that phrase conjures up somewhat nerve-wracking memories of law school classes in which professors use pointed questions to direct classroom conversations. Unlike some of the more intimidating law professors of old, however, Chris uses the Socratic method to help people open their hearts and minds and to nurture self-discovery, civil discourse, and thus democracy itself. Chris is currently serving as both a network fellow at Harvard University's Safra Ethics Center and as a senior executive education fellow at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Chris is also a best-selling author. In his first bestseller, Socrates Café, he travels across America launching philosophical discussion groups designed to stimulate inquiry and debate. In 6 Questions of Socrates and Socrates in Love, he expands the scope of his explorations, engaging in spirited and provocative discussions with Japanese 5th graders, Somali refugees, a Mexican museum worker, an Israeli university student, and Korean Buddhists, among others. These conversations reveal surprising points of intersection between classical philosophy, modern life, and the intellectual richness of societies far removed from the Western philosophical tradition. To date, Chris has helped create more than 500 ongoing discussion groups around the world. In the words of Time magazine, Socrates cafes have found a surprisingly large and diverse following. The subjects under discussion are life's big questions: love and friendship, work and fulfillment, justice and religion, death and aging. His latest project, Constitution Café, is a space dedicated to the Jeffersonian ideal of freedom: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In these groups, a broad cross-section of actual and aspiring Americans grapple with how they would sculpt the United States Constitution if they could start from scratch. His newest book, Constitution Café, describes what led Chris to hit the road once again and launch an initiative aimed at generating a new nationwide constitutional convention. Recently, Chris presided over the Next 10 Amendments crowdsourcing project for the National Constitution Center and also facilitated a 3-day Socratic seminar on the Constitution at the Aspen Institute. Whether he's immersed in a Constitution Café dialogue or presiding over a Socrates Café or some other form of civil discourse, Chris believes that the process of dialogue and the space of human interaction are good for us as individuals and essential for us as a society. Chris encourages us to approach others with greater openness and less fear. It's fitting that we conclude this year's series by stepping back and looking at the whole of the democratic process. Dr. Phillips' presentation, Rethinking Democracy, serves as an ideal capstone to the first year of the Madison Vision Series. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Phillips to the stage today.
How are y'all doing? Anybody here from Newport News? All right. That's where I was born and raised. It's a pleasure to be back in my home Commonwealth. It's been a while. In fact, it's been 6 months since I was at Montpelier at that wonderful gathering. And it's interesting. If anybody had ever told me that I would, even when I was your age, or in my early 30s, that one day I might be giving a talk on a subject like rethinking our democracy, I would have looked at them like they were loopy. But here's what happened. I was a freelance journalist, writing for magazines like Parade Magazine and Southern Magazine. My forte was writing about what I would call unsung heroes, people in their little patch of the earth who were making a difference, not just in their section of the world, but I think they had this amazing social conscience that resonated elsewhere, and I like to share their stories with readers. And over time, I began to ask myself, I love writing about these people, but I want to be one of them. Not that you can't in your own way, of course, as a journalist, but I wanted to be more directly immersed in projects that made our society one in which we all matter and count. I mean, it's really easy to sort of spout out that ethos, but it's another thing to really try to practice it. And I started asking myself, after being a freelance journalist from between 1983 and 1995, well, what is my thing? How can I contribute to things that make our society more livable, more lovable? And so in 1996, during the second term of the Clinton administration, I noticed that anytime I turned on a TV, radio, something was billed as a dialogue or a discourse or an exchange, even if it was on a thoughtful program like NPR or whatever, it rarely was. More often than not, I found that the exchanges among the participants was a lot of browbeating, a lot of one-upmanship. He who could interrupt the most and put down the other best won, whatever that could amount to. And I found that disturbing. I found also, there was way too much intellectual snootiness and pretentiousness. Quite often, people who engaged in these discourses used knowledge as a cloak and a shield instead of using it with a Jeffersonian and Madisonian ethos as a means to diffuse knowledge and spread knowledge in a way that makes us more enlightened. Now, I'm a dual citizen of Greece and the United States, a student of the first democracy in ancient Athens, and I felt that a lot of the same pernicious patterns, history never repeats itself precisely, but that a lot of the same patterns that brought about the irreversible decline in Athens were repeating themselves today in my beloved democracy. To the point, in terms of rethinking our democracy, that I began even asking myself, are we still in a democracy? If you subscribe to the belief, as I do, that democracy hinges on an enlightened citizenry, and by that I mean not necessarily citizens who have necessarily gone on to formal education, but who do take the time to steep themselves in the issues of the day by whatever means, and to willingly and even enthusiastically engage one another, especially others who don't see things the way they do. If they don't do that willingly and enthusiastically, if in fact they see that as anathema, then I believe that that is the death knell of a democratic experiment. And so during this second term of the Clinton administration, when he was undergoing impeachment proceedings, I did begin to ask myself in some earnest, what can I do in my modest way, with my modest talents, to arrest what I felt was a very alarming development? And so I harked back to my yaya, my Greek grandmother, Kalliope Kavazarakis, who gave me, when I was little, my grandparents immigrated through Ellis Island in 1922. Last name was summarily changed from Philippou to Phillips. Her husband was Philip Philippou. And she gave me an English translation of Plato's Socratic Dialogue. She became the first Greek teacher. They first settled in Hopewell, Virginia, then moved down to the large Greek community in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. And she used to tweak my cheek as Greek grandmothers do so expertly, leaving an imprint on my cheek, and would tell me that I had the blood of Socrates coursing through me, and that someday I would do, in modern context, what he did in the days of old, where he'd go to the modern day, or to the agora, the marketplace of his time, where people would barter and exchange not just goods, or at least another kind of goods besides other tangible ones. They'd exchange notions of ideas and ideals. Now, back then, of course, Greek citizenship was limited to a select group of males, but nonetheless, for the time, it was quite remarkably progressive. Some patterns that happened then, this was a society on the way up. It was flourishing. People were enlightened generalists. And part of their ethos, there is a Greek term called arete, which means no literal translation, but which means sort of all-around excellence. And part of that all-around excellence was as you tried to become all you can be, to develop those talents that best made you feel like you were an actualized human being, you also did what you could to help others do the same. So you could be not only there were no distinct boundaries between knowledge disciplines, poetry, philosophy, the hard sciences, no distinct boundaries between the inner cosmos and the outer cosmos. So you could explore in a lot of different areas and contribute in some way to sort of a notion of an upward and outward expanding realm and range of knowledge and possibilities for being in the world. Part of that was by helping others do the same, by acting in ways that also elevated others. That was part of their notion of what arete could amount to. After the Second Peloponnesian War, and they lost, sort of arguably, among other things, a rather naked land grab for another place's resources, they lost their confidence. They lost their way. They started turning in on themselves. Virtue became vice. It was no longer celebrated to have healthy exchanges among people of diverse perspectives. Those who became the powers that be suddenly found that to be something to be frowned upon. Socrates, among others, especially younger others who engaged with him, was one of the last sort of men standing. There's lots of arguments and debate about whether he was really democratic in nature, but I sort of take the perspective that he was in many telling aspects. But nonetheless, that form of inquiry where he didn't directly sow seeds of dissatisfaction among young people, but he did inquire with them in ways that made them dissatisfied with the way things were and with the direction their society was taking. And part of that was he was not an atheist. He did challenge the current pantheon of gods, but he certainly subscribed to his own. But so he was charged with impiety and for corrupting the youth. And even though he was given, at least according to history, some options, one of which was to go into exile and to muzzle up his questioning nature, he believed that was a fate worse than death. And so he stayed. And rather than have others execute them, he drank hemlock and died, urging especially his younger cohort of inquirers to go on inquiring together in the way that he had modeled, with the notion that this was the way that made life more worth living. Maybe it wouldn't touch a chord on any sort of pervasive scale in his own time and clime, but just by doing what he did, might reach out across generations to come and touch others in ways that might inspire them to sort of be like Socrates without in any way, shape, or form being a Socrates impersonator, but just being a constructive gadfly and daring to ask questions that you feel need to be asked, and actually daring to use a method that might actually lend itself to revelations of novel and unfamiliar approaches to possible solutions to whatever ailed a society. So when I saw my beloved democracy today in the United States in trouble, I asked myself, well, what could I do? And I sort of harked back to what this thick volume of Plato's Socratic Discourses on Socrates. And I'd read it for the first time when I was 12. I had my heroes like Pele, the soccer star. I had a big poster in my room. Soccer became my thing after I was mercifully cut from the football team. But I also, Socrates in a sense became my hero. Thanks to my yaya, I was no good for making a normal living or even thinking about such a thing after he really spoke to me. And so what I decided to do, let me make sure that this slide thing is working. I decided in my own way, Bill, I've already messed up. Oh, okay. I decided that I was going to take my yaya up on her exhortation to revive a certain type of Socratic inquiry, and there's many types. If you've ever watched an old movie called Paper Chase with John Houseman, you'll see the Socratic method that President Alger had to suffer through, where you just try to make people think that everything they believe has holes in it, and you're paralyzed with doubt, or a kind where you do feel like there may be elements of doubt. With the Greeks, the Greek term is aporia. But there's other elements attached to Socratic inquiry too, including the maieutic, where there's a sort of a midwifery process, where you give birth to ideas that you'd harbored inside that you didn't even know existed within. And also the element of a linctic, where there's no real literal translation, but it sort of means a combination of inquiry, cross-examination, and encounter, continual encounter with others. So I tried to sort of find a nice blend of those things, still fiddling with it after all these years, as my way of resuscitating a version of Socratic inquiry that I call the Socrates Café method, just to differentiate it from so many other versions of the Socratic method that are being bandied about. I had very modest aspirations. I was living in Montclair, New Jersey at the time. And there was so what I did was one day in a place called Wayne, New Jersey. Anybody heard of Wayne, New Jersey? Yes. I walked into a place called Borders Bookstore. Anybody heard of that? They don't exist anymore. But I walked in and I just sort of blurted out in sort of this fit of passion to the community events coordinator this idea I had. I didn't even have a name for it. But I said I sort of wanted to have a cafe for Socrates that he would like to come to. And I, sort of came up with the name Socrates Café. And lo and behold, it more than exceeded my expectations. This was in 1996, at a time of great polarization. But people who did not know each other and who saw things remarkably differently, beautifully differently, who didn't think in terms of black and white or gray area, but in the wonderful, dazzling world of colors, we came together and we talked about what is the best form of examining one's life. Because the woman who proposed the question said she'd been misexamining her life for over 30 years. And so we had this very rich give and take on her question. And I try never to, I rarely propose a question myself. The method lends itself to taking on any question that participants choose to discuss. And so my grandiose plan had been just to have one Socrates Café group, and that was it. I had no greater scheme than that. And what happened was, over time, I switched the Socrates Café to a place, a little sliver of a coffee house in Montclair, New Jersey. The three cafe owners were very thrilled about the idea. We did it. It also appealed to their business sense. We did it on a Tuesday night when they had no traffic at all, but there was a lot of ambient traffic outside, and people would see this little tiny group of 5 or so sitting inside in a semicircle, and they would come over out of curiosity and join in. And what happened was a reporter for the New York Times lived in that neighborhood, and I didn't know it, but she came in and sat on one of our dialogues, and she ended up writing a story about it. Next Tuesday night that I came in expecting, between 5 and 10 at best, there were probably about 150 people. They couldn't fit inside. The people who owned the cafe were both joyful and terrified. And that's when, and I started getting letters from people. I got a letter from a man in prison who said, you know, obviously I can't come there. If I do, they're going to tack on some more years to my sentence. I got letters from people in nursing homes saying, you know, you claim to be bringing philosophical inquiry to the public, but I can't come there. So can you come to where we are? Letters from school teachers saying the same thing. Since I felt that this really growing sense of mission where I serendipitously stumbled on new possibilities, thanks to the fact that this idea touched a chord with others, I quickly let it evolve. And I started going to other places and spaces than I had originally had in mind. And in fact, it occurred to me after the fact that, gosh, lots of people, even who you know, can come to public events, maybe won't feel comfortable coming into a cafe. So I started holding them in public libraries and community centers, going to prisons of all sorts, going to schools of all sorts. I made the circuit all along the coast of different nursing homes and assisted living residences. Quite often I was enlightened that seniors who lived in these residences, who typically never came to any of the activities arranged, who felt they were a little bit mindless, they would, for the first time in 2 or 3 years, come to a Socrates Cafe because it made them think and think hard and think well. And there's something to be said about spending your days engaging in a kind of inquiry where as you explore a question together, a community gels. And you forge stronger connections sometimes among very unlikely or strange bedfellows. To me, that is at the foundation or even bedrock of cultivating a thriving democracy, creating that kind of setting. It seemed to me that at first, at least, that we had to stay away from hot-button issues. First, you have to discover uncommon common ground. And you can't tell people what it is in some sort of schoolmarmish, didactic way. You have to let them discover it on their own. And even if they differ, and as they differ on what possible concrete solutions there might be, they might nonetheless discover that they have many of the same shared hopes and fears and aspirations for themselves, for their children, for the generations to come. And that when they're left by themselves isolated, they form notions of other people that quite often are shattered once they actually engage in a type of inquiry that can be both thoughtful and passionate, that can be methodical without being necessarily systematic, that can lead to consensus or closure but doesn't in any way, shape, or form have to. So what happened over time was I began, groups started forming, I started traveling hither and yon with no funding of any sort, have credit card, will travel. I just started traveling to help people establish their own groups. I didn't want to be Johnny on the spot. I didn't want this to be a cult of personality where people felt I had to be the only one to do that. I believe the Socratic method is a difficult method, but it's accessible. It's rigorous, but it is something that can be replicated and sustained by people, and that they don't necessarily even need my presence one time to get the ball rolling. I ended up writing a guide that's still on our original website at philosopher.org about how to start a Socrates Cafe group. And there's also a guide there for starting a group called Philosophers Club, which is the name of my first children's book, for young people. By the time I started that, I was living in the Mission District of San Francisco and having dialogues with children who didn't have a good grasp of the traditional 3 R's, whose families typically came from Latin America. Quite often they risked a great deal to get here. And what I discovered over time as a volunteer philosophizing with them was that they had these brilliant, nuanced questions and answers that served as kind of a launching pad for developing what I call the 4th R, reasoning. And as they became more adept and imaginative and empathic reasoners, they felt that they wanted to go back and learn the traditional skills and tools that you can learn because it was served to give them a better arsenal for engaging one another. And the teachers would come to me like I had some sort of elixir. Say, well, what did you do? I didn't do anything. I mean, kids just latch onto this like it's nothing. But over time, it really, in some cases, transformed students' abilities. It transformed the ways that some teachers had viewed their kids. Quite often, kids who don't do well on classroom exercises can show teachers their stuff only when they engage in certain type of oral inquiry. And they really could show their stuff in this. And quite often, so-called gifted and talented students, when they're suddenly not a right or wrong answer, but where you have to not just say what you think, but why you think what you think, where you have to have not only the courage of your convictions, but the courage to have them challenged in a non-threatening but inspiring way, well, that can actually lead to others shining who typically don't have their time in the spotlight. And so it was transformative in many ways, and it enhanced and enriched relationships all across the board, whether in a school, a prison, senior center, many groups now in universities across the country, which thrills me to no end. Some of them started by student-centered directors, but many started by interested students. They love the fact that after they graduate, the Socrates Café goes on. And so I started traveling a great deal, very unexpected. When I was much younger and much thinner, I traveled, for instance, there's a thriving Socrates Café in Mandalay Bay Casino. If after you've had a few too many and lost a few thousand too many, what more do you want to do than philosophize, right? So on Tuesday night, they gather together and talk about things like what a success as they cry over their spilt milk. But there have been groups established in so many places. I go once a year, with thanks to one benefactor, to the Navajo Nation Reservation in Ganado, Arizona. I also go to a senior center there where most of the seniors don't speak English, so I have to have a translator. But they're part of the democratic experiment. Many of these people served in World War II. And so it behooves me, as a democratic citizen, to go and engage with these people who quite often are isolated and left out of the conversation. Over time, my still growing and evolving grandiose plan is to develop forms of connection through the internet and cyberspace and video conferencing that can connect all of these thoughtful souls. Still a work in progress, but certainly a direction. That's my wife, Cecilia. And they always have a question for us as we go. This is David. Do you know where this is? Where's David? Where is this? Tacoma Park Library. This was the first library in the nation. By the time I used to live in Tacoma Park, declared the world's first nuclear-free zone. I used to live there. But by that time, I'd moved to San Francisco. I could not find one single library that would let me hold a Socrates Café, even though I tried to tell them that it got people to go back and read the great books, to read the dialogues or read across the knowledge disciplines across the ages that weighed in on the same questions that we discuss. And they just wouldn't have anything to do with it. I was astonished. They would have musicians come in and play music, but they wouldn't allow this form of Socratic inquiry, even though by that time a 73-year-old man, a retired postal worker, was so smitten with this form of inquiry that he went back to school and got his BA in philosophy. But nothing I could do. And quite often I think that, I love book clubs as much as the next person, but I think sometimes if you can bring people together in inquiry around a question, after the fact, they'll go back and read some of these great books that are enlightening and can actually serve to make them a more engaged and civic-minded. In my experience over time, and we always hold the dialogues there in the children's room, because where children feel the most comfortable, and adults sit in the kid-sized chairs. I was just there again just a few months, no, in early March. And I've been going there now for 14 years, more or less. Once I was on book TV, and I bemoaned the fact after my first book came out that I couldn't get entree into children's libraries. I was suddenly inundated with emails from librarians all across the country inviting me to come in. So that's one of the beauties of media. I think libraries, which are one of the great bastions for democratic inclusiveness, are the perfect place to hold these. There's, few gatekeepers, and it's where really diverse groups of people come. Where people come who might not feel comfortable going into a cafe, that they might actually feel that this is not a place where they would be welcome. So you have people with multiple PhDs engaging with people who've never set foot in the hallowed halls. And you have, and quite often with this rich, earthy wisdom that reminds me almost of Zorba the Greek, who have these beautiful views to share and that make me feel like a better person as a result of having had this beautiful opportunity to lock hearts and minds with them. What I have discovered over time is that, or my operating premise was that as we become more civil-minded, we become more civic-minded. And I even put that to the test in my doctoral dissertation when I issued a survey to participants in Socrates Café. By this time, they were just all over the place. This was a dialogue I held with Palestinian Americans and Americans of Jewish ethnicity at what was called a peace cafe in Maryland. And this is my yearly act and spectacle when I go to the western steps of the Capitol on July the 4th. I always send out an email blast to members of Congress. I've yet to get one to attend, to invite them to this event and Socratize with me, as I call it. Quite often I'll get an email from one time I was really challenged. I got an email from a senator who said this isn't the right email to send this to. And I finally got like 5 different email addresses only to have it redirected back to me to tell me that he couldn't come. But at least it was very interesting. But so I try, it's an act of spectacle in a sense, but at a time when our members of Congress are not talking to one another across the aisle, I think it's important to establish for them a model of what inquiry can be about. This was, for a long time, my wife and I lived in the summers in Greenwich Village, and we would have weekly dialogues in Washington Square Park, and just lean against a tree and put up a dog-eared sign and people will come. And quite often, again, not only were fast friendships formed, but the survey that I took, this was called a Socrates Café walk and talk, where we decided to just break up into groups and walk around at Greenwich Village and just move from one group to another and share our ideas and philosophical questions. What emerged in my survey was that many people felt that just by having the chutzpah to come to a public space where most of the people they didn't know, they would engage in philosophical inquiry, that in and of itself was an exercise in civic engagement. That was a revelation to me, because my idea was that as they took part in Socrates cafes, they would also then go the next step and become more involved in other spheres. And about 10 to 15% of participants did become much more involved in other aspects of civic life. And that was good. It was never meant to be sort of this feel-good, get-together dialogue, singing, Kumbaya, and we're all better. No, it's meant to get people more engaged in the process, to feel that they mattered and counted, but that they had to stand up to be counted, and that they had to feel like they could take direct action, even if at first it was sort of, if they felt like they were tilting at windmills. You have to become involved in the process, and you have to take it upon yourself to do so. But it's another thing, again, for me to tell people you matter and count. You are somebody. You have to discover that on your own. I personally believe that autonomy and social conscience go hand in glove, ideally. And so that was one of the great... So my expectation in many ways was met and exceeded as more and more groups... and even after all this time, Americans are a pretty faddish bunch, but still more and more groups are forming. What happened over time, though, was I started getting invitations to other countries. My first book, Socrates Café, ended up being translated in about 20 other languages. And so I started hitting the road and wrote about some of those experiences in my last 2 Socratic books. But again, it helped me learn more about my own democracy by going farther afield and thinking about and rethinking and reimagining and revisioning my own democracy as I went to other places. And again, typically I'll have a friend of a friend from the U.S. who will put me in touch with other people. And then you see that sign that I've carted with me all across the world. I had somebody write in Japanese, "Welcome to Socrates Café. Everyone is welcome." And this question that they proposed is, what makes life worth living? They have a term for that called ikigai. And they talked about the fact that Japan, according to them, no longer has ikigai. Life is no longer worth living to them. A long story, but to make it very short, they felt that the reason that Japan was going to hell in a handbasket was because of young people. They felt that they were the problem to everything. Well, that's one of the reasons I hold these in public places whenever possible, because you never know who's going to come. So lo and behold, this thing's not cooperating. Here we go. So lo and behold, oops, I don't have that with me. Oh my, I didn't insert it. But what happened was a number of young people came out of the Peace Museum, and I'm in Hiroshima. There's a powerful picture that I don't have in this collection of the one building that remained more or less intact after the atomic bomb was dropped. And that was the backdrop for this discourse. And so all of a sudden, the young people who came from other provinces and had gone on a field trip here, they started talking about these projects they hoped to do, global in scope typically, to make sure that what happened there never happened again. But they were so moved by that. But it also changed the way the older people saw the younger people. By the end of it, they no longer felt like declaiming them, but felt like They had just never talked with young people as equals. There's many times when you do have to talk to people maybe on a hierarchical level. But this is meant to talk to one another on the same plane, the same level playing field, in the sense, not in the sense that we're all clones, but that we all have something unique. I may have been 12 or 13 like these kids, but I've never been 13 from their culture in this epoch. And it behooves me to listen to their stories and to try to gain from that. And so this is, I was welcome everywhere. This is in Soweto, South Africa. That's Winnie Mandela's sister. People didn't know me from Adam, and they invited me into their homes. In the tribal democratic tradition there, they're very used to Socratic inclusive discourse, even though they wouldn't call it Socratic. But they invite and welcome people not only to offer their views, but to support their views with cogent, compelling reasoning. And they want everybody to participate, and they knew that. So even when I got together with the poorest of poor people, who considered themselves my host, people who came from other provinces to Soweto with the hope of finding work. It was the 10th anniversary of freedom from apartheid. They hosted me. They insisted on buying me a drink. They wouldn't even think of letting me buy something for them, and we engaged in some beautiful discourses. This is at a soccer stadium, soccer students, but they quickly engaged with me. This was with a 93-year-old anti-apartheid activist named Pocky, who showed me a bullet wound from when he refused to step off the sidewalk when an Afrikaner police officer wanted him off. He said the officer slapped him, and he slapped him back, and the officer shot him. These things happened. And we talked about the tradition of Ubuntu, how they were, and it helped me understand their tradition in this new democracy of reconciliation and forgiveness, how they could overcome and transcend the atrocities that happened, not out of cowardice, but out of great courage and a great sense that they were doing this for their ancestors as well. The thing that I took with me from my travels to South Africa, and this was the second inauguration of Thabo Mbeki, was the excitement still that they had for democracy. I mean, people were marching in the streets and chanting, and it was just soul-stirring. And we can't even get, at this point still, over 90% of people who could vote voted. But how many people vote in a typical presidential election in the United States? 20% of those who can vote? Something pathetic. And I asked myself, gosh, I don't feel that excitement in my own democracy anymore. And again, it got me thinking about rethinking democracy. After the Second Iraq War, I noticed at Socrates cafes, people wanted to talk politics. They couldn't figure out a way to do it without somehow getting into some really heated discourses. What I did find across the spectrum was that people typically blamed our elected officials for the problems that befell us. None of this looking in the mirror and I'm part of the problem. It was these elected officials who make problems and who make promises and then don't fulfill them once elected into office. So I started, and this again, this harks back to all of these things are things that first germinated with me decades before. In this case, I was a student at the College of William and Mary, and I wrote a paper. I ended up, after changing degrees umpteen times, ended up getting a BA in government, and I wrote a paper on Thomas Jefferson's notion that every 19 years or so we should, as he put it, take a tally of every provision of our Constitution and see if it hangs directly on the will of the people. Now, I think Madison would like that idea. I think that it speaks to him. But he did. He felt that every 19 years, it's not that we should rip it up and start from scratch, but that we should ask ourselves if this is the Constitution that we still want, if this is the way that we want powers divvied up, if these are the rights and responsibilities that we're still willing to make some risks and sacrifices for, or if we want a whole new way of governing altogether. Now, Jefferson's idea was not taken seriously in his own time, wasn't taken seriously today, and yet I felt at a time when there was so much of a sense of impotence, like people couldn't do anything to change our government even if they wanted to, that maybe, just maybe, if politicians are a part of the problem, maybe they're not all a part of it. How many of you think our government's pretty dysfunctional? Oh, dear. How many of you think it's just hunky-dory? It's working great. Oh, dear. Okay. So I started asking myself a question that Jefferson might ask himself, and that was whether the Constitution continued to serve as an impediment to our continue to serve as a facilitator of our higher hopes and dreams for our way of governance, or if it was an impediment in some ways. Now, how could I do that? A lot of people in this era, people I deeply respect, Larry Sabato, who's been a big booster of my work, wrote a book called A More Perfect Constitution that I highly recommend. Lawrence Lessig came out with a book called Republic Lost, in which both of them are also, among others, very regarded people who are, and among people across the political spectrum, calling for a new constitutional convention, an Article 5 convention. How many of you would like to see a new constitutional convention? Okay. Well, you know, it's sort of appealed to me, but in my Socratic spirit, I said, well, not so fast. Not so fast. Because if you do it now, it's probably going to be another exercise by the so-called elites, and most other people are going to be left out. Now, why do I feel that's so? Well, here's one reason. The Center for the Constitution in Montpelier, former home of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, actually the father of our second Constitution. That first was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. They did a survey in 2010, and they asked us, comprehensive survey, and they asked Americans, do you like the Constitution, among other questions, do you like the Constitution as is, or would you change it if you could? Well, voters aged 36 and above like the Constitution pretty much as it is. Voters between ages 18 and 36, a significant number would make significant changes. These two groups had something in common. They hadn't read the Constitution. That was the follow-on question. How many of you have read the Constitution in the last week? How many have read in the last month? How many have read in the last year? Okay, it's about half. It's 4,300 some odd words. It's excessively written, pervades every aspect of our lives. It's important to read this baby. It was very thoughtfully written, ingeniously written, and conceived. So before we have another constitutional convention, I think we should read the existing document. I mean, not just read it didactically, but immerse ourselves in it. Have it become part of our individual and communal and societal fabric. Because otherwise, as we rethink our democracy, I think we're still not going to achieve the promises we otherwise might. So I had this experiment, offbeat as ever, quirky but Socratic, where I decided to travel across the fruited plain and ask motley groups of Americans to join with me in this imaginative exercise where they became fellow framers of a constitution, a new constitution. And we would take a tally, starting with the preamble and working our way through it, and ask ourselves, usually we'd have to come up with at least agreement by between 60 and 75% of participants, what new articles, if any, would we conceive if we could, and why? But we had to have, quite often it would take 2 or 3 nights to do this. And it was amazing. At first, people, even though this was totally imaginative, they couldn't even imagine doing this as an imaginative exercise in a pretend way. They felt the Constitution was too sacrosanct. Over time, they really started taking it seriously, and they started coming up with some ideas that they would like to see embedded in a new Constitution. So I started, and I wrote a book about my experiences called Constitution Café. And it's sort of a meditation on Jefferson's ideas, but as you'll see, it also harks back to many of Madison's ideas, too. I went to a high school that I write about in my Constitution Café book, and we tackled the preamble, which of course, sets the stage for everything. And they decided that the preamble wasn't as good as it should be, that it should include some language from the Declaration. They felt like the Constitution, some of the language was a little too sober for them. And they wanted more of the passionate, rabble-rousing language of the Declaration. So they came up with this. Because we, the people of the United States, hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, dignity, and the pursuit of happiness, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America in order to realize these truths and preserve and promote these unalienable rights. The dialogues recounted in my book, it was not meant to serve as the last word for anything, but just as a thoughtful, provocative springboard for further inquiry on if we did revisit our preamble today, what things would we have included in it? One group wanted included some statement in just in our original preamble. They didn't want to make these changes, but one group of high school, elementary school kids in Washington, D.C. just wanted something about to promote education. Constitution makes no mention of education, none. President Obama, especially early on in his tenure, constantly talked about the fact that we all deserve the right to a world-class education. Well, these kids wondered, well, where's that world-class education for me? So they came up with this article for the Bill of Rights. All children of school age in the United States of America shall have the right to a world-class education. Now, we can get lawyers together and convene about what that might amount to as they argue for the Supreme Court, but their point is they would like to go to a kind of school that the president's kids go to. They would like to not have to, for their teacher not to have to spend so much time meeting a mountain of mandates so they can pass standardized tests, which I'm not against standards, but I certainly am against many of the standards that they've set. For instance, kids can learn new languages like nothing at a certain age. Why isn't every child between age 4 and 10 learning 3 languages, especially in a time when just about every school is multicultural? They could learn these and absorb them like a sponge. It's just a game to them. Such a disservice to ourselves and to our democratic experiment when we don't give them that opportunity, because it builds bridges between cultures. It does. The First Amendment, the redress of grievances. I gathered again in Washington, good old Washington Square Park, and I got some Tea Party acolytes and some Coffee Party, MoveOn.org types, small group. But they said, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances. Their beef was you could petition the government all they want, but the government wouldn't even give them time of day. Used to be a time until even up to the abolitionist movement, when you could go directly to Congress with your petition, and Congress felt a sense of duty out of tradition to address your grievance. That was the people's business. Well, the pro-slavery group didn't like that, and so they curtailed that tradition, and it's never existed ever since. So the people have not driven the business in our chambers of commerce in some ways ever since in that way. It was a great exercise in representative democracy, where they gave the marching orders to those who were elected to serve them. So they came up with this, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances. Congress shall make laws that establish a process by which grievances are received, considered, and addressed. Until such time as grievances are appropriately addressed by government, relations between those citizens submitting the grievance and the government shall be considered suspended, and there shall be no retaliatory measures taken by government against petitioners. Now, that's not as far-fetched as you might think. That's a tradition that emerged from the Magna Carta. That is exactly how they operated way back when. This was a great, what is the one last vestige of monarchical power in our Constitution is the right to what? What can a president do? He can give, like a king, he can grant a what? He can grant a pardon. It might be controversial as can be, but he can do that. They felt that there needed to be a check and balance on that presidential power. That it had to be a high hoop, but nonetheless that there should be one, because it wasn't democratic in nature, that it undermined our constitutional republic if it was going to be of a democratic representative bent. So they came up with this: the president shall have no power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, in those exceptional instances in which it can be compellingly, that should be demonstrated, that such reprieves and pardon further the public good. Now, again, you can argue back and forth forever ad nauseum about what that amounts to. So they made a high hoop. A vote of 3/4 of the Senate shall be sufficient to rescind a presidential pardon. Is that bad? Or does it make our constitutional republic, I think, more of what might live up to the vision of Madison? How many of you think that that wouldn't be a bad thing, to have a check and balance on that? Yeah? Okay. I thought it was a very thoughtful article. I won't... This is a really interesting one. I had a dialogue with a group of Eagle Scouts, and we revisited the article on what the requisites are to throw your hat in the ring and run to be president, to be a candidate for presidential office. And you basically just have to be a natural-born citizen, and how old? 35? And they were aghast. That's it? You don't have to have served in the Boy Scouts or showed that you have done this great that you have done all these wonderful activities to make our nation better. You don't have to have served in the military. You can be commander-in-chief and put people's lives at risk while avoiding service yourself. They were aghast. So, again, this is not the last word, but here's what they came up with. One of these kids, as you'll see, had a sister in the Girl Scouts. But this is what the language that they came up with. No person except a natural-born citizen of the United States shall be eligible to the office of the President. They felt that that was good for a variety of reasons. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who should not have attained 35 years, still good, and been 14 years a resident of the United States, following the script. Anyone eligible to be president, though, must be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, when the occasion calls for it. There are times when we have fiascos, when the president comes in smiling from ear to ear. It's like insulting your intelligence when he's trying to spin it in some other way. Brave, clean, humble, and reverent, which they defined as respectful and tolerant, especially of underdogs and people who think and behave differently. He or she shall be prepared, now we're going to Girl Scouts, and shall do a good turn daily, and in so doing shall further do their duty to God and country. Would that be so bad? Taxation without representation, I'm just going to quickly go through that. People felt like if you didn't have a congressman who had a vote, like in Washington, D.C. and the territories and possessions, you shouldn't have to pay taxes. What do you think about that? Why should you pay taxes if you don't have any direct representation? Instead, you have to rely on a representative from another place to supposedly give an ear to your point of view. They felt that that was outrageous, especially given the fact that one of the big things that incited our revolution in the first place was taxation without representation. There's so many people still left out of that. I'm going to leave actually that out too. Armed and safe. The one amendment that I never was able to get 60 to 70% agreement on and the types of diverse groups that I tried to arrange was in the Second Amendment. Typically just cut down. And here's what typical articles came down to. One or the other. The right of individuals to keep and bear arms on their property shall not be infringed. Who likes that? Or, because a well-regulated National Guard and Reserve and well-regulated federal, state, and local public safety departments are necessary to the security of our free states and of our free nation, the right of citizens, while serving in their capacity in the aforesaid organizations, to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Who likes that one? So you have to be serving in some capacity, police, guard, military. Well, that's basically, I met Justice Stevens at the Constitution Center on Monday, and that's basically what he's calling for in a much more winnowed down and more eloquent version of this, of an amendment that he would give. That's only while you're serving as a police officer in the military, some capacity like that, and he believes that's what was the original intent. Mall of America, what better place to go and talk about this? And again, I brought my dog-eared Constitution Working Group sign. Not a sexy title, but it served a purpose. People would come by and just join in on the dialogue. Now, this is the one that I think, they came up with this. The number of representatives shall be one for every 50,000 people. They did not know this at the time, though again, my idea in getting people involved in framing constitutional articles is that they'll then be inspired to go back and read about our founding fathers and our framers and about the get your hands dirty process of framing a constitutional article. This harks back to Madison. Madison, if he'd had his way, there was another amendment in the Bill of Rights. A little bit weirdly worded, and there's actually some argument on whether it passed or not. There's some historical argument about that. It's not included, but the argument can be made that it was meant to be, that it did pass just enough muster among the original states. He basically he believed that vastness in our republic did not preclude intimacy. So if he had his way, by this time, we would have one congressperson for every 50,000 constituents. Is that right, John Morla? How many of you would like that? They would know your name. There would be how many congressmen? There would be, let's see, right now we have one member of Congress for every 700,000 constituents. The Constitution actually gives us the right to have one for every 30,000 constituents. There'd be about 10,000 members of Congress. might be really cool in this high-tech era. Might decentralize the way that they engage. They might not even gather in D.C. anymore, but use high-tech apparatus to just be in their districts, wherever they happen to be, and still engage in certain kinds of intimate exchanges. It would be about 10,000. But again, you know, in ancient Athens, they would corral the first 5,000 people, and they would legislate together. These are not impossible numbers. We tend to think of them as impossible because 102 years ago, Congress froze the number for no good reason. They offered reasons, I think they're casuistic, about why it should be frozen at the number 435. Changed briefly for a little period, but we've been frozen at 435 ever since. What has that done? It's kept those who are elected by the people frozen at 435 as the number of constituents explodes. And so instead, there's this army of unelected staffers. I think the number is 22 per district, something like that. If you add that up, 22 by 435, you're getting about to the number of 10,000. If you could create more intimate districts, you suddenly wouldn't need an army of staffers. You would then have elected public officials. Lawrence Lessig is calling for a constitutional convention where we eliminate private funding of campaigns. I don't know if that's necessary. Madison was such a genius that he envisioned down the road what we could have if we wanted to. We could keep having a vaster yet completely intimate democracy if we wanted to. We have the means right within our existing Constitution. I came away from this project, and if you go to our website for this project, it's constitutioncafe.org, I hope you come away from it as you immerse yourself in these things with a deeper appreciation for our existing document. What I felt was that very little actually needs to be changed. If we had more, if it just takes a majority vote of Congress just like that, we could start gradually increasing the number of members of Congress again. It would eliminate, I think, over time, the influence of K Street. Over time, it would make for a much more pluralistic number of representatives who'd come from political parties in which they did not depend on corporate coffers to run for office. People could run a viable campaign without much money in this day of the internet and cyberspace if we had more intimate constituencies. I think Madison would absolutely applaud the idea, because to heed the will of the people is to have more intimate constituencies. To heed the will of the people is to have a pervasive sense that the people want to feel involved and connected and plugged in. To do that, they have to feel like their voice matters and counts. It doesn't matter and count so much anymore. 75% of the people feel like they don't matter anymore. Rasmussen poll shows that. They feel like if we could, after the government shutdown debacle, if they could, they would just vote out every one of these characters. So, you know, that's the Constitution Center where I'm now a fellow. I gather with students periodically from Constitution High School, and there's my Constitution Working Group sign. So Madison says, he goes on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men, so that we do not depend on their virtue or put confidence in our rulers, but in the people who are to choose them. What's the problem right now? They don't have that opportunity to really choose people who reflect their higher hopes and dreams. It's too vast. My vote, and I hope many more people will sign on, is to get Congress to increase the number of members of Congress. If you want them to do it, if you want to change an institution, just threaten to call an Article 5 Amendment Convention. History has shown that if they feel like their institution is threatened, they'll back down and they'll accommodate you. Jefferson said, and I'll leave you with this, a first attempt, in his last letter to Adams, a first attempt to recover the right of self-government may fail, so may a second, third, but as a younger and more instructed race comes on, the sentiment becomes more and more intuitive, and some subsequent one of the ever-renewed attempts will ultimately concede. For what inheritance so valuable can man leave to posterity? To which I believe Madison would say, amen. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your leading us in this conversation today and making us think about things that we often take for granted. I think that's one of the gifts that you bring to this whole conversation is to remind us that these are questions the Founding Fathers genuinely struggled with, and that maybe they're things we ought to be thinking about today as well. So we really appreciate your your thoughtful leadership nationally and internationally on this front.
Thank you, sir.
We have a small token of appreciation on behalf of the university.
Thank you so much.
We hope this will help you to remember your visit here, and we also thank you for spending time with faculty and students during the day. So it's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And to all of you, thank you so much for coming out right at the end of the semester. We know exams are coming up. It's a busy time of year. But this has been, I think, an important set of conversations for us, and it will continue next year. So look for the announcements for the Madison Vision Series. We will be pulling together thoughts over the summer for next year, and we welcome your ideas and suggestions for speakers as well. So thank you so much for being here. Good luck to everybody with the rest of the semester. Thanks for coming.